Most men in Elkhorn Basin believed winter had only one answer: more wood, more fire, more chopping. That was how families survived Wyoming in 1884. Then Gideon Voss took his money and bought a parcel of land nobody else wanted. Its only feature was the crumbling stone walls of an abandoned frontier fort, 24 inches thick. Most settlers would have torn them down for paving material. Others might have turned the place into a livestock pen. Gideon did something neither group expected. He announced he was going to turn the ruins into his home. At the time, everyone thought he had lost his mind. But months later, when the coldest Arctic front in years swept across the basin, people discovered something strange. The man living inside those stone walls seemed to have forgotten the cold. By late summer, the sound of building echoed across Elkhorn Basin. Axes bit into pine. Crosscut saws sang through fresh timber. Falling trees crashed against the hillsides. Every settler understood the race they were running. Once the first heavy snow sealed the trails, unfinished cabins became dangerous promises. Across the valley, walls were rising as quickly as men could raise them. Yet on a low rise overlooking Wind Elk Creek, Gideon Voss spent his days doing something entirely different. Instead of cutting trees, he cleared sagebrush from the old fort he had just purchased. The old stone walls were low and weathered. Moss darkened many of the blocks. Ancient mortar had crumbled from the joints long ago. Even so, the structure had survived winter after winter, while newer buildings had come and gone. Nearby, Bristle wandered quietly around the ruins. The brown hound paused often to sniff the cracks between the stones. More than once, he settled beside the southern wall, where the afternoon sun lingered longest. Gideon noticed every time. He never called the dog away. He never explained what he was thinking. While the rest of the valley searched for answers in fresh-cut timber, he stood among old stones and watched. One afternoon, 3 men stopped their horses near the old fort and watched Gideon work. The first was Ezekiel Hart, the most respected carpenter in Elkhorn Basin. If a family wanted a cabin that could survive 10 winters, they usually asked Hart for advice before driving the first nail. Beside him rode Boone Mercer, owner of the local sawmill. The third was Thaddeus Pike, a homestead foreman whose opinions traveled through town almost as fast as the mail. Below them, Gideon knelt beside a shallow mixing pit. Lime clay, crushed shale, and dry buffalo grass fibers were blended together beneath his shovel. He carried the mixture to the wall and pressed it carefully into a gap between 2 stones. Hart watched for a while before speaking. "Stone belongs under a house," he said, "not around it. Those walls will pull every bit of warmth right out of your fire." Boone leaned forward in the saddle. "You spent your savings on this pile of rubble when I've got perfectly good lumber sitting at my yard. Winter's coming whether you're ready or not." A grin spread across Thaddeus Pike's face. "Well, if he finishes this thing, folks can always store ice in it. Looks like Voss's cold box to me." The nickname drew a few laughs. Gideon wiped his hands on his trousers and stood. Afternoon sunlight still rested against the southern wall. He placed his palm flat against the stone and held it there for a moment. Then he looked at the 3 men. "This wall keeps yesterday alive." Nothing more followed. The others waited for an explanation that never came. A few seconds later, Gideon picked up his trowel and returned to work, leaving the question hanging in the warm Wyoming air. Gideon Voss had never been a lumberman. He had never spent his life felling trees or shaping log cabins. Long before he arrived in Elkhorn Basin, he earned his living building stone retaining walls and lime kilns in the dry foothills farther south. That work taught lessons most people never noticed. A fire did more than warm the air around it. Given enough time, heat slipped into stone. It settled into brick. It moved through packed earth and lime mortar. Then it stayed there long after the flames were gone. Years earlier, Gideon had stood beside a lime kiln before sunrise and rested his hand against the outer wall. The fire inside had died the evening before. Even so, the stone still carried a trace of warmth from yesterday's burn. He remembered stone walls facing west that felt almost alive after a long summer afternoon. Sunset would come. shadows would stretch across the ground. Yet the warmth remained, leaving slowly, hour by hour. Most people saw stone and thought of cold. Gideon saw something different. To him, stone behaved like a ledger. Every hour of sunlight, every scrap of heat, every small gift from a fire was recorded and stored until it was needed later. Nature had taught him that lesson years before. Now he intended to trust it. The previous winter had given Gideon a lesson he never forgot. At the time, his family lived in a hurriedly built wooden cabin like most others in the basin. On calm days, it seemed adequate. Once January arrived, its weaknesses appeared one crack at a time. Wind found gaps between the boards and slipped through them as though the walls barely existed. Ruth spent hours pushing scraps of cloth and dry grass into every opening she could find. A few days later, she would start over because the cold always found another path. Caleb often slept in his coat. More than once, Martha woke with frost caught in her hair near the edge of her blanket. The iron stove worked without rest. Gideon fed it late into the night until the metal groaned from the heat. Even then, the warmth never seemed to stay where it was needed. The center of the room felt comfortable. A few feet away, winter was still waiting. A wooden bucket set near the far wall often carried a thin skin of ice before dawn. Bristle understood the problem in the simplest possible way. Every evening, the brown hound curled up beside the stove. Sometimes he slept so close to the coals that his fur carried the faint smell of smoke. What stayed with Gideon most was not the cold itself. It was Ruth's silence. She never blamed him, never complained, never asked why the cabin wasn't enough. Watching his family endure it without accusation left a deeper mark than any harsh words could have. Somewhere during those long nights, Gideon reached a conclusion. The problem was bigger than firewood. A house needed a way to keep warmth from leaving the moment the flames grew dim. That realization changed the way he looked at every building in Elkhorn Basin. The cabins around him were not poorly built. Ezekiel Hart knew his craft. His joints were tight. His roofs shed snow. His doors fit better than most men could manage. Yet even a well-built wooden cabin suffered from the same weakness. Its comfort existed only while the fire was burning. A thin wooden wall lived from hour to hour. Heat entered quickly and escaped just as quickly. To Gideon, the situation looked a little like trying to fill a leaking barrel. More wood helped, but only for a while. The answer, he believed, was not a larger fire. The answer was finding a place where yesterday's warmth could remain until tomorrow needed it. His memories of the old lime kilns reminded him that only stone could do exactly that. So, when spring finally thawed the prairie, Gideon didn't head to the sawmill like the other men. He rode out looking for a different kind of salvation. The day he came across a rolling tract of land, holding the crumbling ruins of an abandoned frontier fort, it was no accident. Most settlers scoffed at the parcel, seeing it as barren ground cluttered with useless, dead rock. But Gideon saw something else entirely. He saw an anchor for heat. The very next day, he used his family's savings to buy the deed to the land, officially preparing to wage a long-term war against winter. Once Gideon committed to the old fort, the real work began. The ruins measured roughly 24 feet by 38. Time had not destroyed them, but it had certainly tested them. Several corners had settled unevenly. Much of the original mortar had weathered into powder. Along the northern wall, years of freezing and thawing had opened narrow cracks between the stones. Nothing about the structure was ready for a family. Day after day, Gideon worked through the damage one section at a time. Loose stones came out first. Then he dug a shallow trench around the foundation, exposing the lowest courses of rock. The largest stones were reset near ground level, where the weight mattered most. Fresh mortar followed. Lime clay formed the base of the mix. Crushed shale gave it strength. Buffalo grass fibers helped hold everything together as it dried. The process was slow. A single section of wall could consume most of a day. Ruth carried water from the creek in wooden buckets. Caleb gathered smaller stones that could be used to fill gaps. Martha spent afternoons collecting dry grass for the mortar mix. their progress rarely looked dramatic. Some evenings, it was difficult to tell whether the wall had changed at all. Bristle remained close throughout the work. During the hottest hours, the hound often stretched out beneath the shadow of the southern wall and watched the family move from task to task. Gideon paid special attention to the lowest sections of the fort. Small drainage gaps were left near ground level wherever moisture might collect. Most people would never notice them. That was fine with him. Good building decisions often disappeared once the work was finished. Across the basin, cabins seemed to rise almost overnight. Fresh-cut logs stacked higher each week. New roofs appeared against the horizon. Gideon's project changed more slowly. From a distance, many settlers saw only a man spending precious summer days moving the same stones over and over again. They saw effort. They saw delay. What they could not yet see was the reason behind either one. The nickname spread farther than Gideon expected. By early September, nearly everyone visiting the general store had heard some version of the story. Each time Thaddeus Pike repeated it, the details became a little more entertaining. Sometimes the fort had no roof. Sometimes the walls were supposedly sinking into the ground. On one occasion, Thaddeus claimed Gideon planned to spend winter living inside a stone cellar like a badger. The laughter usually followed before the story even ended. Boone Mercer approached the situation from a different angle. He often stood near the stove at the store, calculating how many board feet of good lumber Gideon had ignored while rebuilding an old ruin. According to Boone, a sensible man could already have a weather-tight cabin standing where the fort sat. Ezekiel Hart rarely joined the jokes. His influence worked another way. A slow shake of the head from the basin's most respected builder carried more weight than an argument. That was the real danger. People were beginning to see Gideon as a man making poor decisions during the most important building season of the year. On the frontier, trust mattered almost as much as supplies. Once people doubted a man's judgment, they became less willing to follow him, help him, or listen to him. The pressure eventually reached home. One afternoon, Ruth heard a few comments while trading for flour. She returned without mentioning them. Supper passed quietly. Dusk settled over the fort. Later, Gideon sat outside washing dried mortar from his hands. Lime had cracked the skin across his knuckles. Several cuts had turned white from the dust. Ruth watched him for a moment. Then she asked a simple question. "Will it be done before the first hard freeze?" The answer did not come immediately. Gideon studied his hands before looking toward the unfinished walls. "It has to be." Nothing more needed to be said. The silence that followed carried all the uncertainty either of them felt. Summer storms usually announced themselves from a distance. This one did not. Gray clouds drifted over the prairie during the afternoon and settled across Elkhorn Basin like a blanket. Rain followed soon afterward. It wasn't violent. There was no thunder worth remembering, no dramatic windstorm, just cold rain, hour after hour. The kind that found every weakness a builder hoped nobody would notice. By morning, Gideon saw the damage. A section of fresh mortar near the lowest northern corner had washed away. Several stones along the bottom course had shifted outward. Water pooled against the foundation where the ground sloped slightly toward the wall. For a long moment, he simply stood there. The ruined section wasn't large. It didn't need to be. A small failure was enough to expose a larger problem. Nearby, Bristle approached the wet corner, lowered his nose toward the soaked earth, then quietly turned away. Later that day, the hound chose a different place to rest. Before noon, Thaddeus Pike rode past and spotted the damage. By evening, the story had already reached town. According to the newest version, Voss's cold box was falling apart before the first snowflake had even appeared. A day later, Ezekiel Hart stopped to inspect the wall himself. He crouched beside the damaged corner and studied the standing water. When he finally rose, his voice remained calm. "Water will do what cold finishes." There was no laughter in the statement. That made it harder to dismiss. For the first time since beginning the project, Gideon found himself facing evidence that his idea alone was not enough. The wall had survived many winters, yet one poorly managed drainage point had nearly undone weeks of work. He did not argue. He did not defend the mistake. Instead, he removed the damaged section stone by stone. Ruth watched from a distance as part of the wall disappeared under her husband's hands. The sight tightened something inside her chest. That evening, Caleb stared at the half-dismantled corner. "Are we going back to the old cabin?" Gideon looked toward the ruined section. Then he picked up another stone. "Not if I learn fast enough." The answer wasn't meant to sound brave. It sounded like what it was. A man accepting that nature had just given him a lesson, and that winter would not wait for him to ignore it. The damaged corner disappeared over the next several days. Most people assumed Gideon was simply rebuilding what had failed. The reality was more complicated. He wasn't repairing a wall. He was correcting a mistake. The pooled water had revealed something important. The old fort could survive winter, only if moisture left before freezing weather arrived. Heat and stone worked well together. Water was a different matter entirely. Gideon began by reopening the ground around the northern side. The shallow trench became deeper and wider. Crushed shale filled the bottom. Loose stone followed. Instead of allowing rainwater to linger beside the foundation, he created a gentle slope that encouraged it to move away from the wall. The mortar changed as well. More lime went into the outer mix. Less clay remained near the surface. The inner layer stayed slightly softer so it could bond with the stone. The exterior hardened into a tougher shell better suited to rain and snow. One evening, Ruth watched him rebuilding the corner for the second time. The amount of extra work seemed impossible to ignore. "Why not just replace what washed out?" she asked. Gideon pressed fresh mortar into a joint before answering. "Stone can hold warmth, but if it holds water, winter will split it." That was all. The lesson had come from the wall itself. A few days later, the ground finally dried. The repaired section looked almost identical to the one that had failed. Most people would never have noticed the difference. Bristle did. The hound wandered over during the afternoon, sniffed along the rebuilt corner, then settled beside it in the shade. Gideon noticed. He said nothing. The wall had passed a small test. Winter would eventually bring a much larger one. By early autumn, the walls were finally ready to carry a roof. That was the stage that convinced many people Gideon had truly lost his senses. Most settlers built upward. Gideon built downward. Instead of raising a light wooden roof above the stonework, he laid heavy cottonwood beams across the opening. A lattice of dried sagebrush followed. Prairie grass covered the lattice. Then came the final layer, 14 inches of sod. Each section had to be cut, hauled, lifted, and fitted into place. The finished roof looked less like a cabin and more like a piece of the hillside itself. From a distance, the structure seemed to sink into the land. The jokes returned. Some said Gideon was building a cave. Others claimed he was preparing a grave large enough for an entire family. The comments never slowed the work. Caleb and Martha helped carry bundles of grass. Ruth assisted with the sod whenever her strength allowed. Nearby, Bristle wandered between the southern wall and the unfinished doorway, occasionally disappearing behind piles of earth, before emerging again with dust on his coat. The entrance faced southeast, away from the worst northern winds. Two small windows sat deep inside the thick stone walls. Seen from outside, they resembled watchful eyes staring across the basin. Inside, Gideon devoted special attention to the hearth. Most families relied on a freestanding iron stove. He chose a different approach. The stone hearth was built directly against the northern wall, so every fire could feed warmth into the masonry itself. Heat would enter the stone long before winter arrived. One evening, as the last pieces of sod were being placed, Ruth stepped back and studied the finished shape. The roof blended into the earth so completely that the building appeared almost buried. "It looks buried," she said softly. Gideon rested a hand against the wall. "That is why it may live." The answer sounded strange. Months later, it would sound far less strange than the cabins surrounding it. The first cold nights arrived quietly. No blizzard announced them. No newspaper would have recorded them. Autumn simply tightened its grip a little more each week until frost began appearing along the creek before sunrise. That was when Gideon started keeping records. 2 old thermometers were mounted inside the stone house. One hung near the doorway. The other rested against the northern wall beside the hearth. A small notebook remained on a shelf nearby. Every day received its own entry. Temperature at sunset. Temperature before dawn. How much firewood had been burned. How long the coals remained alive beneath the ashes. Even the place where Bristle chose to sleep. At first, Ruth found that last detail puzzling. One evening she glanced over his shoulder and smiled. "You keep records of the dog now?" Gideon closed the notebook. "A dog does not flatter a wall." The answer stayed with her. 3 weeks passed. The numbers began forming a pattern. Several nights dropped to 12 degrees outside. By dawn, the interior still remained above 48. The fire often shrank to glowing coals before midnight, yet the temperature inside declined slowly rather than collapsing all at once. Another detail caught Gideon's attention. Bristle no longer spent every night beside the hearth. The hound sometimes slept several feet away, stretched comfortably near the southern wall, where traces of stored warmth lingered through the dark hours. The bucket of water showed changes as well. During weather that once would have produced a thin layer of ice, the surface remained clear. None of this would have convinced the town. Most people had never seen the notebook. Most had already decided what they believed. That was fine. Gideon wasn't collecting evidence for an argument. He was collecting evidence for Winter. And so far, Winter had not found a reason to disagree. December arrived with little warning. One week, the basin looked merely cold. The next, winter came down from the north like a verdict. The Arctic front crossed Wyoming during the final days of the month. Wind swept across the open country without interruption, gathering snow and driving it through the air until the prairie looked less like land and more like a white sea. Visibility vanished. Fence lines disappeared overnight. Drifts formed where none had existed the evening before. Cottonwood trees cracked in the darkness with sounds sharp enough to make people reach for lanterns, thinking someone had fired a rifle outside. Livestock stopped wandering. Cattle turned their backs to the wind and stood motionless for hours. Frost gathered around their eyes and muzzles. At the old postal station north of the basin, temperatures dropped to 34 below zero. Soon afterward, the thermometer sank even farther, 38 below. The numbers traveled quickly. After that, nobody argued about building methods anymore. The jokes faded. The nickname Cold Box disappeared from conversation. Winter had entered the discussion, and Winter did not care about opinions. Across Elkhorn Basin, familiar problems returned. Wood stoves consumed fuel at a frightening pace. Frost thickened along window frames. Water buckets froze near exterior walls. Families pulled beds closer to heat. Every extra armload of firewood seemed to vanish before morning. Dogs understood the situation immediately. In cabin after cabin, they crowded close to stoves and hearths, searching for the warmest patch of floor they could find. Ezekiel Hart's own house was no exception. The cabin had been built well. Every joint fit tightly, every log had been chosen carefully. Yet skill alone could not negotiate with a Wyoming Arctic front. Several nights in a row, Hart woke before dawn to feed the fire. Then he woke again, and again. By the third night, sleep arrived in fragments measured between trips to the stove. Beyond the walls, the wind kept howling. Meanwhile, the fire in the hearth continued to fade. The trial had begun. From that point forward, no man's argument mattered very much. Nature had taken control of the conversation. While the Arctic front battered the basin, the stone house on the rise settled into a different rhythm. There was no roaring fire inside, no furnace-like heat, no desperate feeding of the hearth every hour. A modest flame flickered against the stonework. Beneath it, a bed of glowing coals rested under gray ash. The air remained still. No drafts slipped across the floor. No cold corners waited in ambush. Ruth sat in the far corner, mending a shirt by lamplight. She had not moved her chair closer to the hearth all evening. Caleb read quietly at the table. Martha slept beneath a blanket without her coat. Near the southern wall, Bristle lay curled on the packed earth floor. The brown hound rested several feet from the fire. His breathing was slow and steady. Before dawn, Gideon checked the thermometers. While the temperature out in the elements sank to 36 below zero, within the house, the mercury held steady at 52 degrees. The number would not impress anyone looking for comfort. It impressed Gideon because of what it meant. The warmth had stayed. A wooden bucket near the wall remained unfrozen. Butter inside a small wooden bowl was firm but not hard as stone. When Gideon stirred the ashes, red coals still glowed underneath. Outside, the wind continued scraping across the prairie. Inside, the house seemed almost detached from the struggle. Ruth noticed Bristle sleeping far from the hearth. Then she looked toward the stack of firewood waiting beside the wall. For a moment, she said nothing. She simply picked up one of the logs she had planned to burn that night and placed it back onto the pile. The gesture lasted only a second. For Gideon, it was worth more than any compliment he could have received. On the 5th day of the Arctic front, winter found a new way to test Ezekiel Hart. One of his horses broke through a drift-covered section of fence during the night and disappeared into the whiteout. By morning, the tracks were already fading. Hart saddled up anyway. The search carried him across open prairie, where the wind seemed determined to erase every sign of life. Snow swept across the ground in long white sheets. Landmarks appeared and vanished without warning. Eventually, the trail brought him near Gideon's Rise. At first, Hart almost missed the structure. The stone house sat low beneath its sod roof, dark against the snow, looking less like a building than a piece of earth that had decided to remain above the surface. A sudden gust struck from the northwest. Hart stumbled. Instinctively, he threw out a bare hand to steady himself against the southern wall. Then he stopped. For a moment, he simply stood there. The temperature outside hovered near 36 below zero. Skin normally complained almost immediately in that kind of cold, yet the stone beneath his palm felt different. It was not warm, not the way a hearth was warm, not the way a stove was warm, but the murderous bite he expected was missing. Slowly, he pressed his entire hand against the wall. Years of experience told him stone should be stealing heat from his skin. Instead, it seemed to be holding on to something. A trace, a memory. The remains of warmth gathered long before that morning. The realization arrived quietly. Nobody stood nearby to argue. Nobody delivered a speech. The wall did all the talking. For the first time in his life, Ezekiel Hart understood that stone could return heat just as surely as it could absorb it. A few minutes later, he walked to the door and knocked. When Gideon opened it, no blast of furnace-like heat rolled into the storm. That surprised Hart almost as much as the wall. The interior felt steady. The air did not move. No cold draft brushed against his legs. No corner of the room seemed abandoned to winter. Life inside the house unfolded at an incredibly unhurried pace. On the floor, Caleb was carefully repairing a leather strap, while Martha was fast asleep beneath a wool blanket. At the table, Ruth calmly sliced bread. Even Bristle, the hound resting near the southern wall, couldn't be bothered. He lazily lifted his head before settling right back down, sprawling out comfortably a good distance from the hearth. Hart's eyes moved across the room. A water bucket stood well away from the fire. The surface remained clear. The woodpile drew his attention next. Considering the weather outside, there should have been less of it. Much less. Gideon waited. He offered no explanation. Finally, Hart cleared his throat. How much wood? Without a word, Gideon handed him the notebook. Hart studied the entries, the temperatures, the dates, the fuel consumption. By the time he lowered the notebook, the argument he had carried for months was already gone. The room contained too much evidence, and every piece of it was sitting quietly in plain sight. The Arctic front eventually loosened its grip. The wind weakened, the snow stopped moving. People emerged from their cabins and began comparing stories the way frontier communities always did after a difficult season. A few days later, the general store filled with familiar faces. Boone Mercer stood near the counter, discussing lumber orders for spring. Several settlers listened while calculating repairs, additions, and replacement buildings that winter had made necessary. Across the room, Thaddeus Pike spotted an opportunity. "Well," he said with a grin, "I suppose Voss's cold box didn't freeze solid after all." A few chuckles followed, nothing like the laughter from autumn. Before the conversation could continue, another voice entered. Ezekiel Hart had just stepped inside. Snow melted from his boots as he crossed the room. Thaddeus expected agreement. Instead, Hart interrupted him. The interruption wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. That made it more powerful. Anyone planning to build north of the basin next year ought to visit Gideon's place before ordering lumber, he said. The room went quiet. Several men exchanged glances. Boone folded his arms. "You saying stone beats pine?" Hart looked toward the window for a moment. Outside, winter still covered the valley. The evidence remained visible in every drift and frozen fence line. When he finally answered, his voice carried no hesitation. "I'm saying cold does not care what I used to believe." Nobody laughed after that. The statement landed with unusual weight because it came from a man whose opinion had shaped much of the original skepticism. Months earlier, Hart's doubts had helped turn Gideon's project into a joke. Now his judgment was moving the story in the opposite direction. Questions replaced ridicule. People wanted to know how thick the walls were, how the roof had been built, how much wood had actually been burned. The change happened without Gideon being present. He never stood before the town, never defended himself, never demanded recognition. The strongest argument in Elkhorn Basin no longer belonged to the man who built the house. It belonged to the winter that had tested it. Spring arrived slowly in Elkhorn Basin. Snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first. Mud replaced drifts. Wagon wheels began cutting fresh tracks through roads that had been buried for months. People talked about winter often that year. Not because it had been unusual, because it had settled an argument. Few families could copy Gideon's house exactly. Most lacked a ruined fort. Others had neither the stone nor the time required to build one from scratch. What spread through the basin was not the structure itself. It was the thinking behind it. Several settlers began reinforcing northern walls with thick fieldstone gathered from nearby hills. Others built low stone barriers around their hearths. A handful banked earth against the sides most exposed to winter winds. New houses appeared with smaller entrances and lower roof lines than before. Ezekiel Hart played an unexpected role in the change. Rather than choosing between wood and stone, he started teaching people how the two materials could work together. Good timber still mattered. So did proper joinery. Yet more builders began treating stone as an ally instead of an obstacle. Over time, people developed a name for the idea. They called it the Voss Wall. There were no printed plans, no formal instructions. Knowledge moved the way frontier knowledge often moved. One neighbor showed another. A builder pointed to a wall that faced the afternoon sun. Someone explained why standing water never belonged near a foundation. A father demonstrated how a hearth could share its warmth with stone instead of sending all of it up a chimney. After 2 more winters, patterns became difficult to ignore. Families using stone features inspired by Gideon's work often burned noticeably less firewood. In some cases, the reduction approached 40%. Boone Mercer adjusted to the change as practical men usually do. He sold fewer boards for oversized walls, but plenty of beams still left his yard for roofs and floors. Meanwhile, Gideon remained much the same. One warm afternoon, he repaired a small crack along the northern wall, while Bristle slept in a patch of sunlight nearby. Visitors occasionally stopped to ask questions. He answered them when necessary, then he returned to work. The idea had already begun traveling on its own. A thin wooden wall lives in the present. While the fire burns, the room stays warm. Once the flames begin to fade, the heat leaves with them. By morning, Very little remains, except cold boards and memories of comfort. Gideon's stone walls lived by a different clock. They gathered afternoon sunlight. They absorbed the steady warmth of evening fires. Small amounts of heat that most people never noticed settled into the masonry and waited there. Then winter arrived. The north wind crossed the prairie, temperatures plunged, and the walls quietly returned what they had been given. Slowly, patiently, without drawing attention to themselves. That was how nature delivered its verdict. Not through speeches, not through theories. The judgment appeared in a bucket of water that never froze beside the wall. It appeared in a brown hound, sleeping far from the hearth on the coldest nights of the year. It appeared in the hand of a carpenter who touched stone expecting bitterness and found something else instead. Years earlier, Gideon Voss had placed his palm against a sun-warmed wall and spoken a sentence nobody understood. By the end of that winter, the meaning had become clear. The wall keeps yesterday alive. Gideon never defeated winter. No one on the frontier truly did. What he learned was something far more useful. He found a way to let yesterday stand beside his family when the coldest night finally arrived.